Hello, my name is Mohan Kelkar, and in this video, I want to talk about electricity generation and the difference between the capacity and production. This difference is important to understand how the electricity is provided by fossil fuel power plants versus wind and solar. Power plants are typically rated based on how much power they can generate. So they're rated, for example, as 100 megawatt power plant, 1 gigawatt power plant, etc. And if the power plants operate all the time, they will provide the necessary energy to the consumers all the time. However, if power plants only operate part of the time, then the percentage of time they operate is called capacity factor. Solar and wind farms do not operate all the time. The sun will not shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. According to EIA.gov, the average wind capacity in the US is about 36%, and the average solar capacity is 28.4%, whereas nuclear power plants can run 90% of the times, and the fossil fuel power plants can run between 50 to 70% of the time. We can use the real world data to compare the capacity factors of different energy sources with respect to what the theory offers us. Very simple arithmetic will provide us with enough background information. If you have 1 gigawatt power plant and if you operate it 30% of the time, then over 1 year period, it will provide us with 2,628 gigawatt hours of energy, or 2.6 million megawatt hours of energy, or 2.6 billion kilowatt hours of energy. Knowing the actual capacity in various parts of the world, including different countries, as well as how much electricity is consumed in every country, we can back calculate the capacity factor for various types of power plants. So let's take a look at the worldwide electricity consumption as well as the capacity built in the world. Notice that the consumption has steadily increased from 1985 till today, from about 10,000 terawatt hours to about 27,000 terawatt hours. But notice that the capacity build out was at a different slope prior to 2000, and then after 2000 the slope has increased significantly with respect to capacity build out. And that is also the time when the solar and wind started contributing significant amount of electricity in the worldwide market. Notice that in the world, about 65% of electricity was generated by fossil fuels in 2000, and now the number is close to 62%. There's about 3% decrease in the energy which is provided by fossil fuel. Compare that to wind and solar, when in 2000 it was negligible, but today it's about 10%. So about 10% of electricity is provided by wind and solar. The capacity factor for wind and solar based on the consumption and the capacity is about 20%, and it has remained steady over the last 20 years, and I wouldn't expect it to change significantly. However, notice that the capacity factor for the fossil fuels has decreased from about 49% to about 42%. So when the wind and solar generate electricity, we have to accept that electricity in the grid. So you have to turn down the fossil fuel power plants. And as a result of that, the fossil fuel capacity factors also decrease when more and more electricity is provided by wind and solar. Right now, only 10% of the electricity is provided by wind and solar worldwide. But if that percentage increases, you would expect that the capacity factor for the fossil fuels will also decline significantly, which means we have to build even a higher capacity fossil fuel power reactors to make sure that we have sufficient amount of electricity. We can compare the rate at which our consumption is increasing versus the rate at which the capacity of power plant is increasing. Prior to 2000 in the world, our capacity increase was at a lower rate than increase in the capacity. You can see that the consumption is increasing by almost 50%, whereas the capacity increase is only by 40%. The dotted line represents exact proportions where if there is a 100% increase in the consumption, there is a 100% increase in the capacity. Prior to 2000, our consumption was increasing at a much higher rate than the capacity build out. But look what happened after 2000. As wind and solar started contributing significantly to your electricity grid, the capacity build out is increasing at a much higher rate than the increase in the consumption. You can see that between 2000 and 2021, the consumption increased by about 90%, but the capacity increased by about 142%. So you have to build more power plants with an increasing capacity to compensate for lower capacity factors for wind and solar. This is not only true worldwide, this is also true in the United States. Look at US, where wind and solar started contributing significant amount of electricity after 2000. And you can see that currently about 11% of electricity is provided by wind and solar, whereas fossil fuel provide about 60% of the electricity from 70%. The capacity factor for the fossil fuel power plant has declined as more and more electricity is coming online from wind and solar. So although the capacity factor for wind and solar has remained steady between 27 and 29%, the fossil fuel capacity factor has declined from 50% to about 40%. But notice also how fast we are building new power plants compared to increase in the consumption. Prior to 2000, between 1985 and 2000, the increase in the consumption was about 47%, but the increase in the capacity was only about 17%. This is because the power plants were operating at a higher capacity factor, especially the natural gas power plants. But look what happened after 2000. As soon as the wind and solar started contributing significantly, the consumption has only increased by about 7%, but the capacity has increased up by 53%. So you're building the power plants at a much higher rate, of course, investing significant amount of capital cost to compensate for reduced capacity factor of wind and solar. Same thing is true with China. Again, from 2009 onwards, wind and solar started contributing a bit of electricity. Right now it's about 11%, and the fossil fuel electricity has gone from 80% to about 68%. But also, the same type of graph is visible in China as well. The consumption from 2009 onwards has increased by about 142%, but the capacity has increased by about 200%. So again, disproportionate build out of the power plants to accommodate the reduced capacity factor for wind and solar. According to IEA.org, if you really want to reach the net zero by 2050, between 2021 and 2030, we'll have to increase the electricity generated by renewables threefold, from about 7,000 terawatt hours to about 23,000 terawatt hours. Knowing that the capacity factor for wind and solar is approximately 20% worldwide, means that if you want to increase the electricity consumption from renewables threefold in the next 7 years, we'll have to increase the capacity 15-fold. Looking at the history, it is fair to ask that is it even conceivable that we can increase the wind and solar capacity 15-fold in the remaining 7 years by 2030? But a bigger question and a better question to ask is it fair to ask poor countries who do not have reliable source of electricity to invest significant amount of capital costs so that they can rely on renewable energy instead of building power plants which run on fossil fuel and they have much higher capacity factor. Thank you for listening to the presentation. If you like the presentation, please subscribe to my channel.